أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا محمد بن عبد الله وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد. قال الله تبارك وتعالى في كتابه الكريم وقوله الحق وهو أصدق الصادقين بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله ولتنظر نفس ما قدمت لغد واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم اللهم صل على. My respected elders, brothers, sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Allow me to begin by extending my gratitude to yourselves, the community, and the MC on giving me this opportunity to be with you for the final 2 weeks of this holy month of Ramadan. I truly feel like Orlando has become a second home. I was here just in June. I hope you don't get too tired of me. But it's always a pleasure to be back. You've always been very hospitable, and I've always benefited from my time here. I'm sure you'll all remember what took place last Ramadan. You'll all remember the speaker that you had. You'll probably remember an event or two. But before I begin my introduction to this series, I'd like to provide you and remind myself as well of something that the Prophet seems to mention that you and I need to remind ourselves of very often. A man once comes to the Holy Prophet and he says, Prophet, I want the thawab of being a shaheed. I want the thawab of an individual who, when he passes away, he has no accounting. And when you go through the Quran and the Ahadith and you look at what happens to man on the Day of Judgment, you find that for some, the accounting process can be extremely difficult. Sometimes the Ahadith talk about how many thousands of years you have to stay in one particular position, in one particular place, be questioned for every moment of your life. So he tells the Prophet, I don't want any of this. I want that when I die, I go straight to heaven. I don't want any of this accounting process. So is there any shortcut to heaven that I can possibly gain? And the Prophet doesn't tell him that I want you to do sajda for long periods of time. He doesn't tell him that I want you to pray the whole night and stay up reciting Quran. These are things that are a byproduct of a heart that loves God. You and I have been taught from the time that we're young that we have to pray. But hand on heart, how many people actually yearn to pray? How many people wait for the time of prayer to come? You and I know that we have to fast every month of Ramadan, but who looks forward to this month of Ramadan so that they can fast? And how many of us will leave it until the very last moment so that we fast the absolute bare minimum? A very simple question would be that if there was no Sharia tomorrow for 24 hours, I ask myself, would I pray? Would I fast? Would I give the charity that I give? If this type of upbringing hasn't worked for me, for my children, possibly for my parents, is there something wrong in my understanding of God? That for the past 3-4 generations, I don't see anybody who's yearning to pray. I don't see anybody who's yearning to give charity. I see a group of people, myself, my family, being a people who only because it's incumbent upon them to do it, they're doing it. Only because they've been threatened to go to hellfire, they're going to do certain actions. There's no vigor, there's no flame inside that's making us do these particular actions, at least for the majority of us. It begs the question then, is the God we're worshipping the same God that the Prophet worshipped? Because when it came to salah time for this Prophet, his actions were really different. He cries out and he says to Bilal, Arihna, Bilal, come and give us raha and relief by giving the adhan. On the 15th night of Sha'ban, the Prophet is said to have woken up from his bed. He was in the house of one of his wives. He wakes up from his bed, he goes to pray, and then that wife wakes up and she sees that the Prophet's not in the bed. So out of jealousy, she seems to think that the Prophet's gone to somebody else's house. So she gets out of her bed, gets out of the house, goes knocking on every door of the other wives to find, where is this Prophet? Has he gone to another wife? And she finds that he's not there. He's in nobody's house. So she comes back and she sees that he's in sajda. And she just sees a garment on the floor and she realizes that that's the Prophet. It's night, they didn't have electricity. So she goes back to bed, she falls asleep. And when the Prophet comes back to bed, he hears that she's breathing heavily. So he wakes her up and he says to her, is it possible that on a night like this, you fall asleep in such a slumber fashion? Is it possible that sleep can overtake you to such an extent that you've fallen asleep when so much is available on this particular night? That's the type of God that I want to worship. That's the God that I want in my heart. That's the God that I want to bring up my children with. I don't want to force my daughter to say, wear hijab. I don't want to force my son to wake up for Fajr Salah. I want him to wake up. I want him to ask me when Ramadan is. But how come that's not the God that's in my heart? When I go to the madrasa, why isn't that the God that's taught to me? So this man asks the Prophet, is it possible that I can die this death of a shaheed, such that there's no accounting when I pass away? And like I said, the answer wasn't sajda, it wasn't fasting, it wasn't praying in the night. The answer by the Prophet was that remember death 20 times a day. The society we live in doesn't tell us to remember death. The society that we live in puts death on a fringe. Don't think about it, don't speak about it. But if you come to the lives of the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt, it was quite different. The Prophet, when it came to urban planning, commanded that the graveyard should be somewhere in the middle of the city where possible. That the mosque should be on the outskirts. So people have to strive to go to the mosque. But people get reminded by death quite easily. People would come to the Ahlul Bayt and ask them all different types of problems, but the answer many a time was the same. You and I as men, we know very much how difficult it is even to control the glances of our eyes. Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salam talks about it in one of the dua, I believe dua Tawbah. He says, وَلَحَظَاتَ عَيْنِي, that Allah, I'm asking forgiveness from the movement of my eyes, that they fell on things they weren't meant to. We know very well that if this man cannot even control his own neck and where his head moves, and he cannot control the glances of his eyes and what they fall on, then what respite is there for this individual on the Day of Judgment? What's he going to stand up and say to God? That these eyes that you gave me, I misused them. This tongue that you gave me, I used it for my own pleasure. They came and they asked the Imams. They said, what do? I can't control my face. This man who is so powerful, this man who's been able to accomplish, what hasn't he accomplished? Yet he can't control his own eyesight. He can't control his own tongue. He speaks and then he realizes he shouldn't have spoken. It's like shooting an arrow and then beginning to aim. The words have come out. It's pierced the heart of somebody else. It's hurt my spouse, my parent. And then I begin to regret about it. They say, give us some sort of medicine for this individual whose soul has gone haywire, who he can't control, whose reins of his desires are too strong. And again, the Imam says that I want you to take assistance from the killer of desires. He says, what's the killer of desires? Is it the long prayer at night? It's not. The Imam says, I just want you to remember death. When you remember the reality that you're going towards, your next action changes. In your graveyards, is there not a grave that is already dug? Is there not a 6-foot hole that's already ready? Because it's going to save them time, isn't it? The grave diggers will save time. But whose name is on it? Is it yours? Is it his? Mine? Hers? If it's one of ours, then it begs the question, are we ready? If you're ready, that means you're content with your actions. You know God is pleased with you, so you're willing to go 6 foot down. But if you and I are not ready, it means we're not certain. We're not certain about the last 30, 40, 50, 80 years of my life. Is it possible that after 80 years, you and I are not certain of our actions and whether or not God is pleased with me? I want and I hope that during this 2 weeks that we have together, during these few nights of Ramadan, that we're able to inspire ourselves from the Quran, from the lives of the Prophet and the Imams, into at least making one change with action behind it to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I want that when I cry out on the night of Qadr, I don't just cry to God, but I'm certain that He's heard me. In one of the lectures I'll touch upon it, but have you read what happens to Zakaria when he calls out to God? When he calls out to God at the beginning of Surah Maryam, it's clear that this is a prophet who yearns for a child. Which parent doesn't want a child? He's been yearning for a child, and probably not just once. He's probably asked God numerous times. But he's become so old, even the expression in the Quran is so beautiful. Allah says in the Quran, He says, Zakaria cries out and says, "Oh Allah, my hair has been ignited and is now white." You know when you set something aflame, when you set something on fire, when it goes out, only the white ash remains? He says, وَاشْتَعَلَ الرَّأْسُ شَيْبًا, that my hair is now become ignited, only the ash remains. There's just a few pieces of white hair left on my head. That's how old I've become. Despite that, he says to God, وَلَمْ أَكُمْ بِدُعَائِكَ رَبِّي شَقِيًّا. But God, I've never been let down when I've called upon you. What type of God is this? Because he's saying that he doesn't have a son, he doesn't have a daughter, he doesn't have a child. He must have asked for it numerous times, but God never answered his prayer. God never gave him a child. Yet he's telling God that I've never been unsuccessful in my prayer. Zakaria, how can you not have been successful? You were unsuccessful. You were unsuccessful every time you asked God for a child. He didn't give you a child. Is there a definition of success that I'm not understanding, or a God that you're calling to that maybe is far away from the God that I pray to? That's what I hope to discuss during these next few nights that we have at our disposal. Then maybe we can change the perception of the God that I call out to. I want to pray to that same God that kept Imam Ali alive in these nights of Ramadan. When he used to break his fast in these nights leading up to his death, it was 2 morsels of food. This wasn't a man who indulged in life such that he ate to his full. There's a beautiful poem in Arabic where the poet says, يَأْكُلُونَ بِالْأَرْطَالِ, they eat by the pound load. وَيَشْرَبُونَ بِالْأَسْطَالِ, they drink by the bucket load. وَيَنَامُونَ اللَّيْلَ مَهْمَا طَالَ, they'll sleep the night so long as the night continues. وَيَطْلُبُونَ مَقَامَاتَ الرِّجَالِ, and after doing all of this, they ask God that give us great station in your eyes. فَوَاللَّهِ هَذَا مُحَالٌ, by God this is impossible. There's a certain love that these individuals had in their heart for God. They looked upon him with different eyes. They spoke to him in a very different way. If you and I can only begin to taste that type of love of God, if we can taste that type of worship, then surely even our actions will begin to change. This last 365 days that we've lived, have you ever asked yourself whether or not you were just a waste of space on earth? Last Ramadan to this Ramadan, what difference has my fast made? I'm an intellectual being. If you come to my business, it's not possible that my business has been stagnant for a year. Because if it was stagnant, then I'm a useless businessman or a businesswoman. I know that I've been cutting my losses. I know that any peripherals which are of no benefit to my overheads, which are of no benefit to my business, I cut them loose. I know that I've tried to make things more efficient. I know that I've been looking at the turnover and seeing what positive correlation it can have to the bottom line. That's what I've been doing for a whole year. And if you ask me about my business, I can present it. I can show that there's progression. But have I become such a tangible being that I care about that which I can see and touch and feel? But when it comes to this soul that I'm certain is going to remain with me even in the grave and in the next life, I can't tell you if I've progressed after a whole year. I don't know what I've been doing for an entire year. I give you a very simple example to show you where we've reached. Some of us, not all. 11 months of the year, I probably didn't pray Fajr on time. I probably, especially if you're a young individual, it's your parents who woke you up, your spouse maybe, your children by crying if you've got newborns. Maybe I just made it on time to pray, and maybe some of the nights it even became qada. But these 30 days, I prayed on time. These 30 days, one of the most difficult prayers to pray on time, I accomplished it. But have you ever sat back to ask yourselves why? Why is it that in 30 days I prayed on time? Was it that this love of God found its way into the heart of this individual for 30 days? Was it that all of a sudden I enjoyed speaking to him such that I was waiting for the time of the adhan? And then you realize the catalyst for me praying on time for 30 days was food. That the only reason I woke up and the only reason I was awake at the time of Fajr at Fadila was not because I wanted to meet God, was not because I was yearning and itching to pray to Him and speak to Him. It was because I was worried about the pangs of hunger tomorrow, so that I ate food until the final minute. That you look at the clock and you look at your phone and you can tell where the second hand's going, and you wait until a few seconds and then you stop eating. That somebody who's smoking a cigarette, you can tell. They'll wait until the muaddin clicks the mic a few times and then they put the cigarette off. Why? It shows priority, doesn't it? When you look at the type of worship we do, and everyone to their own, the Quran is clear, بَلِ الْإِنسَانِ عَلَى نَفْسِهِ بَصِيرًا. Man knows about himself. I can't tell you about you, you can't tell me about me. What we can do is just remind each other to introspect. I know about myself and I know my sins more than you, and vice versa. That if you knew my sins, you probably wouldn't shake my hand. Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam says in Dua bi Hamza, he says, "Oh Allah, I ask you for forgiveness from those sins whose pleasures were short-lived. I looked at someone I shouldn't have looked at. And how long was that pleasure last? How long did it last inside me? A few moments? A few minutes? And then I saw something else. And then I became preoccupied. I lied. And how short was that pleasure of my lie? That I was given a bit more time to send that email that I said that I sent, but it didn't reach your inbox." He says, but the negative effects have remained with me. How many times have you walked into a shopping mall and there's a music track being played, which you heard of when you were young, back in high school, but those words haven't left? You could hear the Quran since you were young. Your parents played the Quran whilst you were sleeping. That didn't stay in the head. But this music track that you and I heard when we were young, we heard it a few times. And even at the age of 50 now, I walk into a shopping mall and I can remember it. How many times have you sat with an elder and somebody recites Marthia and the first thing that comes out of their mouth is that it's the same tune to that song I used to hear in the Indian movies? How do they remember it? Because when you take pleasure in something, it sticks with you. It gets ingrained inside you. When you prioritize something, then you value it. I'll give you the example of our children. When your child comes home from school and tells you that he or she has made a speech and wants to read it out to you, you can see the priority of this child and value you give to the child. The child can begin speaking, and even when the speech finishes, I won't know if he's halting or pausing if the speech is finished, because I'm paying zero attention. I'm still writing that email. It shows the value that I've placed in this child. But keep the same child, but change the example. The same child comes home with a bruised black eye or a broken nose. Now all of a sudden that email gets pushed to the back of the priority line. Now all of a sudden you've got full presence of heart with this child to find out what's happening all of a sudden. That's precisely what you and I need when it comes to the worship of God. 30 nights we're going to recite the same dua over and over and over again. There's going to come to a line or two lines that maybe we don't even mean what we're saying. Allahumma rzuqni hajja baytika al-haram fi aami hada wa fi kulli aam. How many mean what they're actually saying? Oh Allah, give me and grant me the ability to go for Hajj this year and every year. But if I just came back from Hajj a few years ago and I found it a difficult task, and I found that the AC broke, and I found that it was extremely a journey that I wasn't looking forward to again, I'm not going to honestly raise my hands to God and tell God, please send me for Hajj again. But compare it to that individual who's been saving up for Hajj their entire life, hasn't seen the Kaaba. That same line coming from that heart, that it is present, is going to come out in a very different fashion to this heart that doesn't even want to go for Hajj. The way we worship God tells you about the God that we hold in our eyes, in our heart. I'm going to give you another example of 15 Sha'ban. I don't want this to be misconstrued, so please give me your attention just so that you understand what I'm saying. 15th of Sha'ban just passed us last month, roughly a month ago, 16th today. So a month back, we passed this 15th of Sha'ban. The 5th Imam alayhi salam, he says that with regards to the 15th of Sha'ban, for us, the family of the Prophet, it is second in line to the night of Qadr when it comes to value. Night of Qadr is when you and I will stay up the entire night, we'll be begging God on our knees, crying our eyes out and opening our heart, asking God to write for us and decree for us in the next year that which will make life easy for us. We ask Him for a long life. We ask Him for children. We ask Him to remain on the right path. This all happens in one night. So we beg God that one night. The Imam say the 15th of Sha'ban, it's second in line to the night of Qadr for us. You and I, since we were young, have you remembered that we've always been taught one of the acts on the night of Qadr that you should do, night of Sha'ban, is recite 3 Yasin. We've always done it since we were young. I remember feeling really guilty about it, because you would be told by your community and you'd be told by parents and siblings that, you know what, you have to recite these 3 Yasin, the first one with the intention of long life, second one with increase of sustenance, and third, that Allah keeps you from sudden death. And it comes to such a state that if you haven't done it, you feel guilty. And so you quickly recite it just so that you can check a box. It tells you about the God that I'm worshipping, that I feel guilty when I come to the worship of God. I want my God to be a God that He just checks a box and tells me that your body was here, forget your presence of heart, you recited in a language you didn't understand, you didn't even know what you were saying, and I'm going to give you long life because you made that intention. And I'm going to increase your sustenance because that's what you asked for at the beginning of the surah. Where is that worship? And where is the worship of Amirul Mu'mineen? Where he says in this dua, Kumail, وَلَا أَسْرُخَنَّ إِلَيْكَ صُرَاخَ الْمُسْتَصْرِخِينَ. I will scream out to you a scream of one who loves you. Imam doesn't say words. Imam doesn't say I'm going to have to recite lengthy surah. Imam doesn't say I'm going to have to raise my hands to you with lengthy dua. He says I don't even need to speak. He says I just need to scream out to you in agony. And that's enough for my voice to reach you, because it comes from the depths of my heart. Because I'm in so much pain that words can't express what I'm going through. God, I'm just going to scream out to you. He accepts. Imam says even this is a form of prayer. Now when you come on the 15th of Sha'ban and you recite Yasin 3 times, it's all well and good. And please continue to do it if you wish to do it. But I ask you, the God that we're meant to be worshipping is a God that when I speak to Him, I have presence of heart with Him. I know who I'm sitting with. It doesn't have to be 3 Yasin, does it? It could be 1. It could be Surah Al-Fatiha. It could be another surah. But sometimes when we get so bogged down into doing things in such a rigid fashion, then our God becomes a God of checkboxes. A God who just looks at my form and outer exterior appearance. That did you do this, Ali? Did you recite this on this night? Then I'm going to give you. But the Imam says that the God he worships is someone else. It's a different God altogether. Just for your information, there is no hadith about reciting 3 Yasin on the 15th of Sha'ban. And it's not even present. I mean, you open Mafatih al-Jinan, go to 15th of Sha'ban, you won't see any 3 Yasin being there. It actually was taken from a group of people, Fatimiyun, who entered Masjid Al-Aqsa. They began reciting it. It got adopted by the Sunni school. It got adopted by the Shia school. The Sunni school were doing it continuously on the 15th of Sha'ban. For them, it's one of the most powerful nights as well. And now you'll see that there's a major movement from the imams to make sure the congregation knows that this is bid'ah in their terminology. That this is not something that the Prophet sanctioned. And now all of a sudden they're stopping and they're not doing it inside their mosques. I reiterate that you can do it. Reciting Quran is one of the most best things, one of the greatest things that you can do. My only concern is that we don't make an affiliation with the imams. Because as soon as you tell a child that the imams did this, all of a sudden it holds a weight inside them that any other action doesn't do. And so now when they're weighing out, what should I do on the 15th of Sha'ban? They say, well, the imams told us to recite this 3 Yasin, so I'm going to do it. Even though the child doesn't understand what he's saying, even though he's reading the same translation 3 times, and he's lost himself and thinking about something else, that's not the type of worship that the imams alayhim as-salam have encouraged us to do. Allow me to conclude then by saying that our end goal should be that we should come to a realization of a God that we yearn to speak to. A God that I want to worship, not that I have to worship. A God that I'm certain that when I call out to Him in any language or none, that even if I scream out to Him, He interprets my pain and He answers my prayer. So tomorrow's discussion is titled The Unknown God. And I hope I can change at least one person's perspective on who God may actually be. I don't claim to know who God is, but nobody does. Because كُلَّ يَوْمٍ هُوَ فِي شَأْنٍ. Every day is a different manifestation of God. Every prophet came down manifesting God in a different light. Isa alayhi salam came down manifesting God and Al Hayy, and he was giving life to the dead. Zakaria had a different manifestation. Ayub came manifesting God as As-Sabur, and the one who is totally patient. When you approach God, you begin to swim in this shoreless ocean of His names, that you just reciprocate His love with Him. That you speak to Him one day out of fear of being punished. Out of another day, you speak to Him because you're so close to Him. Musa cries out to God, and he says, oh God, أَبَعِيدَ أَنْتَ كَيْ أُنَاجِيكَ. God, are you so far away from me that I have to scream out to you? أَمْ قَرِيبَ كَيْ أُنَاجِيكَ. Oh God, are you close to me that I just need to whisper to you? And Allah replies to Musa, and He says, Ya Musa, أَنَا جَلِيسُ مَنْ ذَكَرَنِي. Musa, I'm intimately sitting with the one who calls to me. That the Imams used to have these times of munajat. Munajat literally means a whispering. They didn't need to scream out, they just used to whisper to God and speak to God. On these 21st night of Ramadan, you would find Imam Ali lying and resting against a pillar in his mosque in Kufa, whispering to God, introducing himself to God. Imam Zain al-Abidin in Abu Hamza, he introduces himself to God. Sayyidi, لَعَلَّكَ أَنْ بَابِكَ طَرَدْتَنِي. Oh Allah, maybe you've thrown me away from your door. Oh Allah, maybe you found me in the circles of the jobless and idle people, he says. And that's why you no longer want to listen to my speech. I end on a positive note, reminding you and I who God really is. An anecdote I may have shared with you before. A man enters into the palace of the king, and he goes through the first checkpoint. He gets to the door of the palace, and he begins to knock and knock. Nobody's opening up the door. Finally, these guards open the door, and he's screaming and he's shouting that he wants to meet the king. So the guards look at him and they say that it's midnight. What is wrong with you? You come to the palace of the king, have some sort of decorum. You don't come at midnight to speak to the king. He says, no, I want to speak. He's my king. I want to speak to him. The king wakes up. He calls for the guards. He says, what's the commotion? They say, this man, this beggar has come. He wants to speak to you. He says, no problem. Let him in. He comes in. The king sits on his throne. The man stands in front of him. He says, oh man, what is it that you want? In the middle of the night? He says, oh king, I want that whenever I want to speak to you, I should be allowed to come and speak to you. So the king says, fine, I agree on one condition. The condition is that you don't come dressed like this to my palace. You come dressed in rags. Is that how you respect the king? You come like this, in this fashion? At least come in nice clothes. So then the beggar replies, and he says that it's not humiliating that a beggar comes into the palace of the king dressed in rags. What's humiliating is that the beggar should leave the palace of the king still dressed in rags. Because then you begin to question, what type of king is this? That he saw a beggar in front of him and he didn't give him? That the beggar had to open his mouth for the king to see his need? The God of the Ahlul Bayt, the God of the Quran, is a God where you don't have to open your mouth to. A God who realizes and understands what's in your heart. But you need to reciprocate that with Him. Those are the lenses through which you have to see Him in the first place. If you see Him as a God of wrath, then that's what you'll get. If you see Him as a God of formality, that I can't speak to Him until I open a dua book, then that's the God you're going to get. But as I'll show you tomorrow, that was clearly not the God of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. It's a Thursday night, and I'll conclude by just a mentioning of Abu Abdullah Alihusain alayhi salam. The night before Ashura, Imam tells Abbas alayhi salam, he says, can you go to the enemy ranks and just tell them to give us one more night? But one more night for what reason? Had they not achieved Jannah that they needed another night? Did they have sins on their shoulders? Were they afraid of dying, that they wanted one more night of staying alive? Had they not spoken to their spouse enough? Had they not kissed and caressed the heads of their children enough? Imam says, ask for one more night so that we can worship, for we love worshipping our Lord. On the one hand, you find a group of people, tens of thousands of them, who had been taken by the dunya. They spent the night laughing and joking, indulging in whatever they did. And on the other hand, you find a group of meager handful of individuals praying to God like the buzzing of bees. That night was also a night of generosity. I believe if Hussein hadn't asked for that one more night, then Hur wouldn't have come the next day. Because had the battle begun a day earlier, only God knows that Hur might have just been taken by his comrades, and he actually might be an individual that we might be cursing today. But those 24 hours gave Hur the ability to think. Think about what he wants in his life. Think about when he finally takes his last breath, does he want to be certain that God is pleased with him? Or does he want to be afraid of returning back to God? I don't want that to be us. That if death strikes us, we shouldn't be amongst that group of individuals who's doubtful as to whether or not God will be pleased with us. We don't know when death will come. It has no terms and conditions. It comes to the healthy and the ill. It comes to the young and the old. The one thing we know is that it's coming. So the one thing we can do is prepare for it. وآخر الدعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.